Okay, hi there. This is Dr. Matthew J. Trom, and this is an asynchronous lecture on the intellectual property module of the 4501 course. And we are going to talk in this section about copyright for engineers. Just a quick reminder of kind of the way that I do these things. I like to speak for about 15 minutes and then give you a break. And so we'll go for about 15 minutes and then stop and start the next video, and we'll just keep doing that until I've exhausted the slide deck. So this is the first of what is going to end up being probably several videos on copyright for engineers. Now, especially because this is a copyright presentation, I want to say two things. First is that I am not a lawyer, and this lecture is not meant to be legal advice. The goal here is to educate you guys on the four foundational types of intellectual property, copyright being one of them. So please, before you make any legal decisions, seek advice from a bona fide lawyer. I am not a lawyer, so don't just blindly follow this advice without talking to a real lawyer first. Secondly, again, this is a copyright presentation, and so I want to be sure that I acknowledge Professor Danny Sokol, who is a professor over in the Levin College of Law here at the University of Florida. And I have used a number of legal definitions and content that Professor Sokol provided in this presentation, and I'm using that with his permission, but I want to be sure to credit him for that. Um, okay, so um, you guys have already seen this slide because this is one of four intellectual property for engineers presentations, but want to just go over it quickly if this happens to be the first of those presentations that you're watching. So what is intellectual property? Well, according to the World Intellectual Property Organization, IP, which is shorthand for intellectual property, refers to creations of the mind, such as inventions, literary and artistic works, designs, and symbols, names, and images used in commerce. IP is protected by law, which enables people to earn recognition or financial benefit from what they invent or create. Uh, by striking the right balance between the interests of innovators and the wider public interest, IP legal systems aim to foster environments in which creativity and innovation can flourish. Now, I start with all four of my IP presentations with this slide, but for copyright, this is particularly important because, as we will see as we move through the slides, in my opinion at least, copyright law is incredibly screwed up, and at least in the US. And so, as I've talked about previously, for intellectual property rules to work, there has to be this balance between rewarding the creators for their creative work, but then eventually allowing those creative works to pass into the public domain so that anybody can use them, so that they can be, remixed, reused, so that other creative works can be built on top of the initial creative works. And for most of the other types of intellectual property, there's a time limit, right? Particularly patents, there's a time limit beyond which IP passes into the public domain and then therefore can be used by everybody. And copyright law was originally set up that way so that after a certain period of time, copyrighted works do in fact pass into the public domain. But as we will see, copyright law over the past, say, about 50 years in the US have changed such that it's now basically indefinite, right? So copyright basically lasts forever. It's not quite that way, as we'll see, but they keep extending the duration that a copyright is applicable, and it wasn't meant to be that way. And so what this does is it kind of tips the scale in favor of the creators and makes it more and more difficult for these creative works to pass into the public domain. Now, you guys know from taking this class that I am all about finding loopholes and breaking the rules in order to gain competitive advantage. And I think copyright is a place where creative people like engineers can definitely take advantage of a system that again is pretty broken, at least in my opinion. And that opportunity is made even more salient and tangible for you guys, the generation of students who are taking this class now, because you guys are digital natives, right? When I was a kid, like, hey, we didn't have computers. Everything was done analog. Computers, was kind of a novelty thing. Things like MP3s and the internet and all that stuff, none of that existed. But now you guys are digital natives. You were born with all of these things in place. And so you think about these technologies in a very different way than people of my generation. I'm Gen X, very different from my generation because you were born into a world where all these technologies existed. And so I think there's a real opportunity here for engineers to be both creative professionals and digital natives simultaneously, and then to, for lack of a better word, exploit the existing American copyright laws to your advantage, to squeeze a ton of value out of your creative pursuits. And I'll give you some examples of how I think you guys can do that. But this is, I think, for you guys, an incredible opportunity to generate a lot of creative products, and to continue to profit from that creativity for a long period of time. Okay, so this is another slide that I've shown previously. This is just a comparison between the four different major types of intellectual property protection: trade secrets, copyrights, patents, and trademarks, and then the benefits, duration, weaknesses, and required steps for each one. And I'll just sort of leave this here, so that you guys can refer back to this. You can maybe pause the video and look at this if you'd like to just kind of be reminded of what realms of knowledge each one of these IP types covers, and then what are the benefits, duration, weaknesses, and required steps, and so forth. But today we're going to talk about copyright. So copyright is one of our four principal types of IP. And what's copyright? Well, from the U.S. Copyright Office, which is an office within the executive branch of the U.S. federal government. According to that office, copyright is a form of intellectual property law with protection grounded in the U.S. Constitution and granted for original works of authorship fixed in a tangible medium of expression. So here's the really interesting thing, is that copyright does not protect, as we'll see in a second, the underlying ideas, but it protects the medium of expression. And so, well, okay, what does that mean? So what copyright does and doesn't cover. So copyright protects original works of authorship, including literary, dramatic, music, and artistic works such as poetry, books, art, music, magazines, movies, advertisements, computer software, web pages, video games, architectural drawings, and architecture. Interestingly, it also protects sales, presentations, and client proposals. Now, I have, for the purposes of an engineering audience, I have intentionally highlighted these last couple of items because you might not, as an engineer, think that a lot of the things that you create can be protected through copyright, right? Because normally engineers, you think about like patents and trade secrets, but look at all these things that we produce that are covered by copyright law, right? In particular, computer software, web pages, video games, architectural drawings, and architecture, right? So just as a specific example, it is very likely that you are working on a design project in 4501 that involves some type of user interface, right? And so although the expectation is not that you're going to like code the whole thing up and have this wonderful, perfect, touchscreen software ready to go by the end of 4501, you will have to put together at least sort of a rudimentary command structure and command tree for your project, and that's computer software, right? The moment that you codify it, it becomes computer software. And so that software that you generate as a result of this project can actually be protected under copyright. There's an interesting history here because in the beginning of the computer industry in the late 70s and early 80s, when I was a kid, it was not clear that software processes could be protected by patents, and so a lot of the early software manufacturers, software companies, used copyright as the means of IP protection for their software, and that created the great and still ongoing debate between open source versus closed software, right? So you think of like Linux, for example, as an open source operating system versus something like Windows or a Mac operating system, which are closed. That whole kind of creation of open source versus closed software was spawned in the late 70s and early 80s by the use of copyright to protect the IP underpinning that computer software. So, pretty interesting history there. Um, the other thing, particularly for engineers, that's interesting is that architectural drawings and architecture itself can be protected by copyright. So, mechanical engineering has a subdiscipline, which is architectural engineering, and the works of architectural engineers, both the drawings and then the final appearance of the building, right? What the buildings as they're built actually end up looking like, especially if they're unique and signature buildings, those drawings and then the buildings themselves can actually be protected by copyright in a way that other architectural engineers and designers that come along cannot copy the appearance of those buildings. This is actually the newest addition to copyright laws, this addition of the word architecture. But again, incredibly interesting and incredibly relevant to at least a sub-discipline of mechanical engineers. And then, of course, this last one is that copyright law also protects sales presentations and client proposals, right? Which is super relevant to engineers because you guys are going to be sitting in on those sales representations and client proposals. You're probably going to be writing a lot of them, especially if you're in a job like a sales engineering job. And so what this says is that if you write a sales pitch or a proposal and you give that to a client, so long as you clearly articulate that that content is copyrighted, the client can't then just grab information out of your sales presentations and your proposals and spin it into a product of their own and present it to others, in competition with your sales pitches and your proposals. So that is an incredibly powerful protective tool to keep the intellectual property that's contained within your sales pitch protected. So a lot of kind of really interesting engineering applications to copyright law that you might not have initially thought of when you thought about copyrights. Because, right, isn't copyright for books? Well, yes, but it's also for all these other things that are relevant to us as engineers. So interestingly, the thing that copyright does not protect are things like facts, ideas, systems, methods of operation. And those things usually are protected by trademarks or patents, and so copyright and patents are different in that patents basically protect the ideas, systems, methods, whereas copyright protects just the means that those things are recorded and communicated. Although it's true, though, that copyright may protect the way that these particular items are expressed, right? So, like the example of architecture, right? The underlying idea of how the building supports itself, the structure, any novel innovations with the power or the structural system of the building, that all needs to be covered under patents. But how those innovations make the building look, right, the way that those innovations are expressed, that can be protected by copyright law. Okay, so here is a summary of what copyright does and does not protect. So copyright does not protect fundamental ideas. It only protects the way that ideas are expressed in a tangible medium, and it also regulates ownership issues and creative works made for hire. And a really interesting question that's actually come up recently is the ownership of academic content, right? So, why when a university professor gives a presentation, who owns the content of that presentation? Is it the professor or is it the university? Now, I'm right up against 15 minutes, so I'm going to stop right here. But I do want to talk a little bit more about this question of who owns a lecture, and so that's where we'll pick things up in the next set of slides. So see you in a bit. Thanks.